My name is Jonathan Locke. I am a software engineer in the notaries team as part of R3, and I'm here to talk to you today about the JPA Notary, which is a new feature coming in Corda Enterprise 4.3. It is the next generation highly available notary. It supports Oracle 12c in a rack configuration and CockroachDB. The reason it's called the JPA Notary is that it uses the Java Persistence API standard to connect to the database, and for that reason it requires a compatible JDBC driver. There is a table that I've prepared which contains the current notaries, the Simple Notary, the MySQL Notary, and the JPA Notary, as well as the various differences between them. So as you can see, the Simple Notary shares the node's database connection, which means whatever the node is configured to use, the notary will also use. It supports any database that the node supports. So the node currently supports Oracle 11g and 12c, Postgres 9.6, SQL Server 2017. So any of those databases are also supported for the Simple Notary. It supports Liquibase, which is what we use for database schema migration. As the version of Corda changes, there can sometimes be changes to the notary database schema, and Liquibase handles that. It does not support highly available mode. The MySQL Notary is the previous generation highly available notary, and the only database supported there is Percona 5.7. It uses its own connection separate to that of the node, and it does not support Liquibase. It obviously it supports highly available mode. The JPA Notary, similar to the MySQL Notary, has its own database connection. It supports Oracle 12c in a rack configuration as well as CockroachDB. It supports Liquibase via the DBM tool only. The database migration tool is an external tool developed by R3 that is part of the Corda Enterprise suite of software that will allow one to set up a database schema or migrate a database schema to a new version. One thing to note is that CockroachDB at this time does not support the database migration tool. We may look into adding that in a future release. And it obviously does support a highly available mode. So CockroachDB is one of the new databases supported by the JPA Notary. What we find is that all notaries exhibit degraded performance to a certain extent as the databases become larger. The simple reason for this is that because notaries exist to prevent double spend attempts, as you try and notarize a transaction, the notary has to examine a larger number of states in order to make sure that the states you're trying to spend have not been spent before. So it is an unavoidable problem. But what we found is that CockroachDB exhibits less performance degradation than other databases because it uses a different underlying technology. CockroachDB is built around RocksDB. What we also like about CockroachDB is that it's horizontally scalable. It tends to scale very well, and you can adding more nodes to the cluster can increase performance. Obviously, there are limitations on that, but in general, we found that to be true. And it's very configurable in terms of how data is split between the various CockroachDB nodes. There is enterprise support available for CockroachDB, and that is available in a greater number of regions of the world. It uses the Postgres SQL dialect with minor differences. Thus, in order to use the JPA Notary with CockroachDB, you will need a suitable Postgres SQL driver. So Oracle 12c in a rack configuration is the other new database supported for the JPA Notary. The Oracle database is obviously a very popular database for large enterprises. And whereas the node did support Oracle 12c before, what is new to this is support for Oracle's rack technology, which stands for Real Application Cluster. So this means that you can have a highly available JPA Notary configuration backed by a highly available Oracle database, which in Oracle's terms is Real Application Cluster. The database management tool, or database migration tool, which I mentioned earlier, has been upgraded to support the JPA Notary. It is the recommended way of performing schema setup for a JPA Notary. Just as I mentioned before, just note that CockroachDB is not supported by the database management tool. So there are some usage examples there. Essentially, you need to provide either the dry run or execute migration statements, then the config file, and then the mode needs to be specified as JPA Notary. The config file can be a full node config file with the configuration required for the JPA notary, or it could also be a special configuration file created specifically for the database migration tool. I've got an example that can be used for that later on in this slideshow. So here's an example configuration file for CockroachDB. So this is a sample configuration file for a JPA notary that is configured to talk to a CockroachDB for the notary part of the database, and the node part of the database is talking to a PostgreSQL database. As I said, the CockroachDB also uses the PostgreSQL dialect, which means you'd only require one driver in this case. So just some things to note is that the in order to use the JPA notary, you can see that there is a JPA configuration element that is nested within the notary configuration element. That's how it knows that it is a JPA notary. There's the data source properties and database configuration elements. The data source properties are a collection of Hibernate configuration properties. They are pretty similar to Hibernate's configuration properties with some slight differences, but really there aren't many. Just the important thing to note there is the data source.url property, which is obviously required. We've specified the username as Corda there. The reason we have not specified a password is that we're actually using SSL authentication for the CockroachDB database. SSL is one of the selling points of CockroachDB, which is supported even the free version of the database. You can see if you have a look at the JDBC URL that we've specified there that we've set SSL mode to require, and we have to specify the SSL root cert, the SSL cert, and the SSL key. The key needs to be a PK8 key. We in the documentation for Corda Enterprise 4.3, we do have detailed setup steps for CockroachDB that will tell you exactly how to generate the certs and keys required. Note that the generation of those certs and keys is handled by CockroachDB itself. It provides tooling that you need to generate those. Just note that the process that is running Corda needs access to these certs and keys that are generated, otherwise it will not be able to connect to the database. In the database configuration element that is nested within the JPA configuration element, we can see initialize schema is set to false and validate schema is set to true. Initialize schema only works with an H2 database, so we set it to false anyway, but it wouldn't do anything with this configuration because we're using CockroachDB. Validate schema we've set to true, and what that does is it uses Hibernate to validate that the schema is correct. That's quite a useful thing just to debug if there's any if the schema setup has proceeded as expected. At the bottom of the configuration file, we can see data source properties and database. These are for the node itself. You can see that it is a PostgreSQL database where the user is Corda and the password is 1234. Obviously, 1234 is not a very secure password, so we would not recommend that in production, but it's just here as an example. And this is the final slide. I have included an example of a configuration file that could be used if you wanted to run the database management tool. So this configuration file is configured to talk to a Oracle RAC configuration. You can tell that by the data source URL, which has got 2 servers listed for the Oracle RAC instance. And this is a minimal config. So this is all you would need to have if you wanted to run the database management tool. So you can see that as compared to the previous slide, there is no database configuration element and there's no validate schema or initialize schema. Those are not needed for the database management tool. They are optional. So even if you're running this as even if you're running the notary worker from this file, it wouldn't require the database configuration element, although note that this is not a valid Corda configuration file because it doesn't. There's a lot of other things that it doesn't have, such as the legal name of the node itself. And it also doesn't have the service legal name, which is required for a highly available notary worker. As this is just for the database management tool, those have been omitted here. Note that for running the database management tool, The data source class name is required so that it knows what data source to instantiate, as is the data source URL. The other properties are optional, but because we know that password authentication is required for this particular database, we must pass on a username and password. Note the format of the Oracle RAC JDBC URL, that there are two servers listed there with they happen to have the same port, but they needn't have the same port. That depends on how you've set up your Oracle RAC instance. And notice the service name. It is important to get the service name correct. The URL would fail if the service name was wrong. It is possible to use this connection with the SID instead of a service name. However, I believe that the JDBC URL would be in a slightly different format. So that's everything that I have for you today. It was just a quick intro on the JPA Notary, what it is and what it does and how to use it, and I hope this has been helpful.